Hello everyone, and welcome to our e-tail webinar sponsored by Looker and presented by AutoTrader. Finding Power in Data, how AutoTrader built a self-serve data platform. My name is Isabel, and I'm responsible for the digital content here at WBR Insights. I'd like to take this moment to welcome our speakers for today. So we have Thomas Toomey, Account Executive at Looker, and Edward Kent, Principal Developer Data Engineer at AutoTrader. So before we start, I'd like to draw your attention to a few housekeeping items about the console that we are using today. The windows you see on your screen are completely customizable, meaning you can minimize them, maximize them, or move them around the screen as you see fit. If you accidentally minimize a window for a reason, don't worry. Just click on the toolbar menu at the bottom of your screen to bring it back up. Now, we are going to try to save some time for some questions at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to submit them as we go along during the presentation via the Q&A window that you see on your screen. Finally, our colleagues are on hand if you have any technical issues throughout. Just send us a message via the same Q&A window, and we will address that for you. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tom now for a further introduction and then to kickstart with the presentation. Tom, the floor is yours.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Isabel. Welcome, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us today. Just one more item of housekeeping before we kind of start and kick off with some introductions. There'll also be a recording of today's webinar shared afterwards for you guys to enjoy on demand. So if you have to log out, etc. So to kick things off today, realistically, everybody is talking about digital turnarounds. And today we're going to hear from one of the most successful businesses to pivot from traditional print to online marketplaces, AutoTrader. Now, back in the day, the car buying experience was a really time-consuming one. It typically involved purchasing the latest copy of AutoTrader, taking out a pen, circling the interesting cars, and then spending a month of Saturdays plodding across countless dealerships' forecourts before finally selecting a suitable car. Probably an experience most of you on the webinar today will be familiar with, and possibly one you mightn't miss. On June the 28th, 2013, the final copy of this iconic magazine, AutoTrader, was published, marking the end of a really well thought out transition from publisher to a purely digital business. Now, this wasn't simply a knee-jerk transition made of reaction and market inertia. This was one made with intent, the intent to cement AutoTrader's position in the market. And that's worked incredibly successfully. So today, 80% of all time spent on online car classifieds is on autotrader.co.uk. And once a prospective buyer's research is complete, they tend to visit just an average of 1.2 to 1.5 dealerships. So an incredible change. From speaking with the guys at AutoTrader and from hearing the story of their digital journey, it's clear that the team has always embraced that change. That said, while this change was always welcomed, AutoTrader were under no illusion that it would require a different way of thinking. It would require new cutting-edge technologies and perhaps most importantly, the right organizational culture to back all this up. So to tell that story today and to share more on the technologies that have helped to support that journey, I'm delighted to introduce Edward Kent, the Principal Developer and of Data Engineering within AutoTrader. So over to you, Ed, and we'll kick off the slides.
Thanks very much, Tom. My name is Edward Kent. I'm a Principal Developer in the Data Engineering Squad at AutoTrader, and talking to you today about how we built our next generation data platform and specifically how we enabled self-serve. So the agenda for today, roughly speaking, I'll give you a brief introduction to AutoTrader as a company, who we are, and talk a little bit about our history. I'll then talk about the new data platform that we've built, how we enabled self-serve data on that data platform, specifically using Looker, and then I'll finish up with an example use case where we successfully used Looker to replace a legacy bespoke application. So AutoTrader, for those of you listening in the UK at least, you most likely will have heard of us. We are the UK's largest digital automotive marketplace. So if you were to head to autotrader.co.uk right now, you'll see something like this. Online classified used car search listing. And we sit at the heart of the UK's vehicle buying and selling process. We bring together the largest, most engaged consumer audience with the largest pool of vehicle sellers. And while we're known for our used car search listings, we actually offer a host of products both for consumers and for retailers. So for consumers, we offer products including things like valuations and price indicator flags to help consumers gain confidence that they're buying vehicles that are good value. We offer dealer reviews and ratings, vehicle check products to help consumers verify the vehicle they're interested in buying hasn't been marked as stolen, hasn't been marked as having outstanding finance, etc., as well as some editorial content including car reviews. What people probably aren't familiar with, though, is the services that we offer for our retailers as well. So in addition to our classified advertising platform, we offer a host of tools to help manage your forecourt, finance solutions, valuations to help you price your stock and source stock at the wholesale at the correct price, and various tools around education and insight. So AutoTrader are the largest automotive marketplace in the UK, and we're also a very big presence just in the web in general. So we were recently ranked as the 16th biggest website in the UK, with over 55 million monthly cross-platform visits. There's a bunch of stats on this page. My favorite one is the stat that says we receive 4 times more automotive searches than Google. So from that, you can see that we operate at quite a large scale. And as Tom said in the introduction, we are now a fully digital business, but we have a kind of roots in the print business. So we launched back in the 1970s as a print magazine. Originally, we were called Thames Valley Trader, and that was a classified magazine published weekly, in which you go out to the local newsagent and you would buy. And for many years, that's how we operated, until 1996, when we first launched our website. autotrader.co.uk, and just for context, 1996 was 2 years before Google launched, so we were sort of quite early in dipping our toe in the digital kind of water. But for a number of years, we then operated with both a digital presence and a print business. 2007 was an important year. That was the year digital revenue first matched our print revenue. We launched our first mobile apps in 2010, and then finally in 2013, we discontinued the print business and became a fully digital business. And just for a bit of context there, those are some screenshots of our very early iterations of the website back in the late 90s. So you can sort of see how much we've changed since then. So to establish that change from print to digital, we've had to embrace a whole lot of change around kind of the way that we work, the way that we deploy software, and the way that we deal with data. And it's perhaps no surprise that at AutoTrader, we are dealing in a lot of data, given the scale at which we operate. So consumers are interacting with AutoTrader every single day. I'll caveat this slide is a couple of months old, but the figures are broadly the same. Roughly 55 million sessions a month, with a peak of around 4,000 interactions every single second. So huge amounts of interaction with the website, all of which is being recorded and generating data. And the type of data being generated is more varied than ever before as well. We operate multi-platform, so as well as our desktop site, now the majority of our traffic comes through mobile sites and apps. We have various APIs that third parties can connect to us with. We're connected through Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. We record data around emails, calls, online chats, etc. So the volume of data and the variety of data that we're collecting is ever increasing. And on top of that, we increasingly want to make decisions using data in real time. And that's not just in our company. This is a sort of general trend. So the world that we live in is sort of becoming increasingly data hungry, and it's becoming more and more accepted that if we have a question, you can just pull out a mobile phone, look up an answer, and get an answer to the question that you had almost instantly. So that's sort of the world we live in. As an industry, though, it's perhaps no surprise that our customers are also data hungry. So the retailers for whom we host adverts have questions like, what's my car worth, how many people are viewing my adverts, which advert is performing well for me, which are not performing well. Consumers who come to our sites want to see ads that are most relevant to their search. They want to know if the vehicles they're buying good value, etc. And this trend is ever increasing. So it's very important that we make it as easy as possible to gain access to data. But historically, this is really quite hard. If you want access to data, in the past, you would have to be able to connect to a host of transactional SQL and perhaps NoSQL databases. You've got to navigate quite complex schemas, write some complex SQL to get the answer that you're looking for. And then as GDPR has come in, complexities around PII and making data available also come into play. So at AutoTrader, our typical sort of platform for running analysis historically was our data warehouse, which I'm now terming the legacy data warehouse. The pattern here is that we've got a bunch of transactional databases for which we snapshot using an ETL tool. We aggregate the data down, and then we store it in the data warehouse. Our data analysts can then come into the data warehouse and run their queries to generate reports. And this pattern has served us well for a number of years, but it's got a number of disadvantages. Firstly, for us, the data warehouse we were using was on-premise, and that meant that as our data volumes grew and grew, it became more and more expensive to store. Another problem is around making changes. If you have a new type of report that you want to generate and there's no existing data set that's suitable, you need to come to the data warehouse team, work with the experts in that team to develop the new kind of the new data sets that serve your purpose, and it really kind of becomes a bit of a bottleneck. So anyone who needs access to data has to go through this centralized team. So with this in mind, around 2 years ago, AutoTrader set out on a mission to build a new data platform built in the cloud. And this mission was to empower AutoTrader and its customers to make informed data-driven decisions and to democratize access to data and promote a self-serve platform. So how exactly did we go about doing that? Well, we did so in 2 ways. Firstly, we wanted to lower the bar to entry in terms of the skill set required to gain access to data. So rather than being an expert in writing SQL and being able to navigate these complex databases, we wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to go in, self-serve, and gain access to the data that they needed. Simultaneously, though, we wanted to raise the ceiling in terms of our capability. So we wanted to be able to run complex machine learning models alongside the sort of traditional ETL type processing that we were doing in the past. So the first exercise we did was think about the types of personas that would be accessing data and the ways in which they would want to access that data. So we came up, this is a subset of the roles that we came up with, but broadly speaking, we had data analysts, data scientists, product leads, and developers. Each of these roles has a different skill set. They've got different levels of technical capability, and they want to do different things with their data. Some just want to be able to run basic queries and get an answer to a fairly simple question. Some want to interrogate the data in a more deep way, perhaps run machine learning models on it. And some would want to access the data programmatically. But the key thing here is that although they have different skill sets and different requirements, all want to be able to self-serve. So what does our data platform actually look like? This is a sort of high-level overview. And at the core is this data lake built on Amazon S3. So a data lake, unlike a traditional data warehouse, stores its data in a raw form, in sort of unstructured form. And it's then aggregated and processed as needed. So with AutoTrader, we're using S3 to store data. Data's coming in from various transactional databases. We've got data coming in from Kafka, as well as an event tracking tool that we're using called Snowplow. Orchestrating that ingestion is a tool called Apache Airflow, which is a scheduler, and that allows us to write quite complex, they're called DAGs, directed acyclic graphs, that manage the dependencies of the various tasks to run these sorts of ingestion processes. Data is ingested into the lake using a tool called Scoop, and another tool called Kafka Connect that allows us to ingest streaming data. Sitting alongside S3 is our cloud data warehouse, and for that we're using Google BigQuery. So to manage the data in S3, we're using a compute tool called Apache Spark. It's a cluster computing framework that allows us to process data using both traditional kind of ETL type processing, as well as more complex things like machine learning models. So Apache Spark we're running on top of Amazon's EMR platforms, Elastic MapReduce, that allows us to fire up a Spark cluster in the cloud on demand. So sitting on top of all that data in the lake are our analytics stack. And for analytics, we're using two tools. We're using Databricks and we're using Looker. I'll talk in a little bit more detail about both of those in a little bit. And then the final thing to note is that data that's processed in the lake is, as well as being made available in our analytics tools, is exported out to various data-driven products. So I talked about our valuation system earlier. That's a data-driven product. So Apache Spark reads data from the lake, processes it, writes it back out to the lake, from which it's exported to online tools that can then serve out things like valuations in real time. We also have a number of other data-driven products, including supply and demand forecasting. We've got a recommendation system for consumers to show kind of relevant similar adverts. And then we've got a search relevance scoring system that helps show the most relevant adverts in a search to our consumers. So keeping track of data in the data lake can be a little bit tricky, and then if you're not careful, it can become kind of a little bit unmanageable. So in order to help with that, we came up with this concept of zones. So broadly speaking, data flows through the zones and becomes more and more refined. The transient zone is where data lands initially, so I talked about ingestion from online databases. Data lands in the transient zone in its absolute rawest form. From then it's moved into the raw zone, and in that process we do a very minimal level of cleaning. So we remove personally identifiable information, so we anonymize things like email addresses, IP addresses, postcodes, etc. That raw zone is then immutable, so it never changes. So we've got a complete record of all our data historically. Moving on from there, we then refine data. We've got a refine zone, which contains sort of refined data sets that are suitable for use by data analysts, but perhaps they've not gone through the quality checking that means we want to expose them to people who aren't completely familiar with the data. We've also got this thing that we've termed the user zone. So this is a zone that's writable by our analysts using things like Databricks. And they can use that as a sort of temporary store if they're experimenting, if they're producing one-off data sets, etc. But we make no guarantees about the quality of the data in the user zone. And then finally, we have this trusted zone. So the idea here is that this is a sort of most important data. It's gone through various quality checks, and it's usable without caveat by everyone in the business. There's no kind of subtleties or complexities around understanding it, and it's just available to all. So data lands in the transient zone in its rawest form. At that level, our users have no access to it at all. It's then automatically cleaned and dropped into the raw zone. As the data becomes more and more refined, it transitions through the refined zone, where it's used by our data analysts, and then finally, the most dependable data that's used for reporting around the business lands into the trusted zone. So I talked about two tools that we're using for analytics. The first one is Databricks. So Databricks provides a managed notebooking environment based on Apache Spark. And this is a great tool for our analysts and data scientists to use to kind of experiment with data and to experiment with more complex things that you can do with data, like machine learning models. You can write notebooks using Scala, Python, R, and raw SQL. As well as schedule regular tasks and build basic dashboards. And we found Databricks to be a really useful tool for our developers and analysts, but the technical kind of skill set required to get useful insight out of it is perhaps a little bit too steep for some of our non-technical users. So this is where Looker comes in. So Looker, if you're listening to this webinar, I assume you know what Looker is and what it does, but it's broadly speaking a business intelligence platform for running analytics and building dashboards. So for us, we're using Looker both as a tool for our analysts to use using Looker's explore function to dive into data and do kind of deep level exploration, and they can also build dashboards that can be shared around the business. The thing that we really liked about Looker was its data modeling layer, which acts as a sort of single source of truth. And that's really important if you've got a large team of analysts, perhaps working across different business areas. Using the data modeling layer with LookML means that everything gets committed to a repository where it's then viewable by everyone else. And you can get this collaborative development using GitHub pull requests so that there becomes kind of no siloed knowledge around how these models work. Everything is open to everyone, and everyone can see the history of how it's been developed. Looker can connect to various different data sources. For us, we're connecting to Google BigQuery, and it's fast, flexible, and pretty straightforward to get going with. So I'll talk a little bit later about the POC that we did with Looker, but in a matter of weeks we were able to go from nothing to useful dashboards built on a data model that had been built by multiple different analysts. So Looker as AutoTrader. We signed with Looker in, I think it was late 2018, so we've been using Looker for just over a year. And in that time we've gone from nothing to over 250 weekly active users, 95 content creators, over 500 dashboards, and over 1,000 looks. And this kind of level of adoption didn't come completely naturally. We had to work to make sure that we were building things in the right way, we were making things available in the right way, and that we were training people in the right way. So I'll talk a little bit more now about how we went about that. So when we first started using Looker, we did a proof of concept rollout, and the idea was that we wanted to build a specific dashboard to help us understand how a new product that we were launching at the time was performing. So the product that we launched was called Vehicle Check. Effectively, what we were doing was on our adverts, we were allowing our retailers to run a check against the vehicle they were advertising to see if it had been marked as stolen, to see if it had outstanding finance, etc., and then publish onto the advert the results of that check so that consumers viewing the advert gain confidence that that vehicle was a trustworthy vehicle. And in launching a product like that, we want to do so in a data-driven way. So we want to make sure that when we do launch products like that, it's having a positive effect on our retailers' adverts, and that it's being taken up at levels that we expect it to be taken up, and we want to understand kind of exactly what the impact of a product like that is. So the first thing we did was to identify the various roles that we would need. So Looker offers 3 levels of access: a viewer role, an explorer role, and a developer role. So broadly speaking, a viewer can view pre-curated dashboards and apply basic filters. The explorer can build dashboards and drill down into the underlying data, and the developer is the person in charge of building the underlying data model. So in our case, our viewers were people like our product leads who were perhaps wanting to take a quick look at how the product was performing, but weren't interested in drilling into the underlying data. Explorers and developers were then our data analysts. So the first thing we had to do was make our data available in BigQuery. So when I gave the overview of the data platform, I talked about the various different zones. The way that we've structured our platform is that as data moves through our S3-based data lake, it transitions from transient to refined. We've then deemed our trusted zone to be what we put into BigQuery. So we've got a process that can move data from S3 to BigQuery, and that's orchestrated using Airflow. So the first thing we had to do was make sure that all the data that we needed to power this dashboard was available in BigQuery. Once we'd done that, we had to build a set of LookML data models, which we termed the core models. So we had this idea that we'd probably have some core entities around the business so things like customers, stock, etc., and we would be able to build a single model for each one of those entities. And then finally, once all that was available, data was available to explore in Looker, and we were able to build dashboards. So you can see below, that's an example of the dashboard that we built. So this rollout was a success, and we very quickly decided, yes, we want to stick with Looker, but it came with its challenges as well. So both with the rollout and in the months after, we sort of became a victim of our own success in that we started to get unmanaged model proliferation. So initially, we were quite lenient about what sort of models we allowed people to create. If people needed, for example, a new dashboard and there wasn't a suitable data model, they would go off and they would just create their own new model. And while this meant that we were able to move very quickly, it also meant that probably we weren't thinking carefully enough around whether the models that people were building were suitable, whether there was something existing they could have reused, etc. So I'll talk a little bit about how we solved that in a bit. Another interesting thing was that we actually identified some new personas based on some people in the business that we weren't aware were accessing data in the ways that they were. So, for example, we had a team of people in our sales squads who are kind of act as the go-between between the less data-savvy salespeople and our data analysts, and they're sort of in charge of taking perhaps generic reports and then customizing it so that it's usable by a particular salesperson to talk to a particular customer. And so this meant that we had to create a bunch of new roles in Looker. Specifically for us, it was a sales viewer role and a sales explorer role. And then finally, we came up with this concept called a product researcher explorer as well. So when we make available a data set through our trusted zone, we say, okay, it's been through a number of quality checks, etc. It's dependable. But what we found was that actually people were willing to forgo some of those checks in order to get early access to data, so to get a sort of beta data sets available very quickly. So for those users who we made sure were able to understand the caveats and the risks involved in using that data, we made available some extra data sets, and we made those available to this product researcher role. Another thing that we found was this concept of a core model. So a model built around a core entity in the business became something of a bottleneck. So, for example, a customer entity, we tried to build a single customer model and then extend it as needed by the various different squads that were using that customer data to build their dashboards. But what we found actually was that people had their own requirements and actually their own kind of view on what a customer constituted. For some squads, that was perhaps customers. Customers would mean only our retailers. We also offer private online adverts. So as a private customer, you can go and list your car for sale. And for other squads, then our customer data set would want to incorporate those types of customer as well. And it's the same around every single entity that we built. We sort of found that a single core model wasn't quite sufficient. Another problem that we found was that there was a bit of a disjoint in knowledge between different LookML developers. So what I mean by that is a developer who builds, for example, a customer model builds it because they're working in a specific business area and they understand one aspect of our customers, but they perhaps don't understand the full context around that data set. We also found that because of that, some of our models were sort of having a bit of a lack of ownership. So if a model's been contributed by 5 different developers, no one felt like they owned it. Things were getting a bit messy. No one felt like it was their responsibility to clean up and to apply some sort of rigor on how these models were being developed. And then the final challenge for us was performance and cost, not of Looker, but of the underlying data store, BigQuery. So BigQuery is cloud-based. Its cost model is you pay a small fee to store your data, and then you pay per query based on the amount of data scanned. And we found it was very easy for our users to rack up some quite big costs. by scanning kind of large amounts of data in quite inefficient ways. And this meant that it was costing us quite a lot of money, but also the performance of dashboards built using those large data scans was quite poor, which led to a poor user experience. So how did we address that? First of all, we created some different roles with different permissions, and I'll talk about those in a little bit more detail in the next slide. We then thought a little bit more differently about how we were constructing our derived data sets, not just in the Looker modeling level, but in the level below as well. And we came up with this concept called domain-based data ownership. So again, I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in one of the next slides. But this was the sort of way of thinking that we applied not just in Looker, but in the levels below as well, right through the data platform. And then finally, on the cost consideration, we realized that we would perhaps have to build some summary tables to answer some of the most common queries. So rather than, for example, a common query might be how many advert views is this specific retailer getting over the last 12 months, rather than having to scan through each individual event and build out the answer that way, we would build some sort of materialized summary tables and persist those in BigQuery for some of our most heavily used and data-hungry dashboards. So on the roles, the way that we thought about this was we've got three levels of role in Looker. There's a viewer, an explorer, and a developer role. And each of those roles probably wants to access slightly different data sets. So for us, we grouped our data sets into sort of three broad, what we've termed model sets. So we've got a customer performance model set, and that's data around how specific customers are performing, so how many advert views they're getting, what sorts of leads they're getting, etc. And those are the data sets that our sales squads are really most interested in. We've got a manufacturer and agency data set that we have made available to the users who are dealing with, so manufacturers are kind of interested in understanding how their brand is performing, for example, and then products and technology. So we've got a whole bunch of data sets that are used by our products and tech teams, showing things like how quickly certain bits of the site are loading, things like that that we don't want to necessarily make available to our sales squads, but they're interesting to them. So for our viewers and explorers, we've made available 3 different viewer roles, 3 different explorer roles, and then finally for the developers, it was fine for us to make that available across all models. So that's the role that our data analysts have. So they're building up the LookML data modeling layer. So this data domain way of thinking that I discussed earlier, originally we had this concept of these kind of core entities, and like I say, what we found was that different parts of the business had a different idea of what these entities constituted, and they also have different questions that they want to answer about them. So they have different KPIs, for example, around those entities. So by way of an example, we've got a customer entity, and that customer entity will be used by various different squads to answer various different types of question. So the way that we've been trying to model this, and this is still something of a work in progress, is to build derived data sets to serve the needs of each of those domains. So in this example, we've got data landing into a sort of raw or staging area in its raw form, and then we build derived data sets for different needs. So for the customer example, we're bringing in raw data into the staging area from both snapshots and change data capture, so event type processes. We're then building a derived customer data set that can then be built on and augmented for various different squads. So our customer performance squad have one set of needs, so they can then take that first iteration of a derived data set of a customer and extend it to their needs. Likewise, our finance squad can do the same, and marketing squad can do the same again. that results in a table being persisted in BigQuery, and then on top of that we can build some lookml, and from that lookml we can define dimensions and measures, and the measures drive our KPIs. So this way of thinking has helped. It's meant that our core models are no longer a bottleneck, and the different analysts in the different squads are able to build relatively simple models that serve their needs without these kind of very large, complex, unwieldy models becoming an issue. So the other thing that's helped us be successful with Looker is our training program. And this is something that we've been kind of inspired by Airbnb's Data University concept. And they came up with this idea of a data university, and they have this little quote: in order to inform every decision with data, it's not possible to have a data scientist in every room. Instead, you need to scale your skill set. So for us, what that's meant is that we've been running as a kind of squad, we've been running training courses around the wider business, around concepts to do with data. So whether that's data education pieces, so kind of education around statistical processes and higher level overviews of our data platform, through to specific training courses for the various tools that we have. For example, Looker, Airflow, Spark, we run training courses for. And then we've also got training needed around how to access the data that you need, what data is most relevant, etc. So we've been running with our Data Academy, and we've been running 3 types of training related to Looker, specifically for the viewer, explorer, and developer roles. So for our developers, so these are the lookml developers, we've been running a course on kind of the fundamentals of lookml, how to build models, how to build views, etc. That's a relatively recent course. When we did the POC rollout, we had some help from Looker with some training that they ran for us, but we've now moved that in-house and we're running that ourselves. So as well as lookml training, we've also found we had to run training on how to use Git and specifically GitHub pull requests. We've got Explorer level training, which we've termed Looker for business users, and this is aimed at people who want to kind of drill down into the raw data using Looker's Explore functionality. Typically, these are people like product leads, delivery leads. They're kind of data hungry, they're data savvy, but they don't necessarily have the skill set to go and write raw SQL. And then we've got our viewers, who are people who we're making available these kind of pre-built, pre-curated dashboards. So these are people around the entire business, from both our sales squads right through to our product and tech teams, who are interested in consuming data but don't necessarily have the need to go and build dashboards or explore it at a lower level of detail. One thing that is worth pointing out, our developer training, we actually don't call developer training, we call modeling data in Looker, specifically because what we found was that developers, so software developers in the business, were kind of looking at the various training options available and decided, I'm a developer, therefore I should go on the developer training. Whereas in actual fact, most of these developers are not writing lookml, they're not building that data model, they're probably more interested in the Explorer training. So our viewer training is run, generally speaking, it's not run specifically for Looker. Instead, it's run for specific dashboards. So for example, in our sales squads, we've launched a number of dashboards that they're using in kind of day-to-day conversations with our customers. Our sales teams go through various training courses quite frequently on how to have specific types of conversation. Perhaps if we have a new product launching, we need to train our sales squads on those. So it was part of that training that we've been showing them how to use Looker, how to use the dashboards, etc. So as well as that training for our viewers, we've also launched this Looker Champion network around the business. So this is a set of people who we've sort of identified as being particularly competent or interested in Looker, and we've kind of asked them if people have questions around Looker, are you happy for people to come to you? So that question could be, for example, how to construct a specific type of filter on a dashboard, or how to find a dashboard that serves a specific need to them. So these Looker champions are distributed around the business, and we've got posters up in our kitchens, kind of with the faces of these Looker champions saying, yes, if you've got questions around Looker, these are the people you should come to for help. And that's been really successful. And actually, these posters around the kitchen have also served a dual purpose. So as well as directing people to these Looker champions, it's also kind of just raised awareness around the business around what Looker is, that it A, exists, and B, there are people you can go to talk about it, and that's been really helpful. So I'm going to wrap up by just talking about an example use case. So this is kind of something that we launched a couple of months ago. So after Looker had been established for several months at AutoTrader, and it was something we've termed the performance dashboard. So this is a tool that is primarily used by our sales teams, and it's to help them have conversations with our customers around how their adverts are performing. So the sorts of conversations they might be having are kind of over time, the number of advert views your adverts have been generating is dropping, or perhaps it's been increasing, or perhaps you're getting lots of search appearances and advert views, but they're not translating through into leads. People aren't inquiring about your adverts. And on the back of those conversations, people can, our sales teams can have good conversations with our customers and really help them to improve their adverts. So it's a really useful tool. And it was something that's existed for quite a while at AutoTrader, but in the form of a legacy bespoke application. So this was a tool that we wrote in-house. It had a sort of quite a deprecated back end. The front end was something that we had to write using D3, and it became quite unmaintainable. The original developers had left. No one quite knew how it worked, and it was becoming a bit of a liability. So we knew we had to replace it with something, and it felt like Looker would be a good candidate for this. So our data analysts were able to leverage existing data sets to build a suite of dashboards. So I don't know if you can see this, but there are a set of tabs that you can page through. So there's a tab for search appearances, a tab for ad views, a tab for advert quality, leads, etc. And they were able to do this without any input from developers, which is fantastic. And in a matter of weeks, we were able to go from nothing to something that was usable by our sales squads. So there's not much more to say about that, but that was a really important use case. And importantly, it meant that we were able to build it without any additional developer effort. So if we'd not had Looker, then the alternative would have been set up a development team with both back-end and front-end developers and build something that would have perhaps taken several weeks to build. So that was a really good success story. Looker allowed us to replace our bespoke legacy application. The dashboard was built by our analysts with no developer input, and these dashboards are now in day-to-day use with our sales teams, and they talk to our retailers using this as sort of part of their day-to-day conversations. So that's excellent. And then one final piece, which is really cool, is that the same data model that we used to build this dashboard can be used by our advanced users to then drill down into the underlying data. So if there's a sort of weird spike, for example, in advert views, they're able to go in and really dig in and find out exactly what caused it. So that's really helpful. And with that, that's me done. So I'll hand you back to Tom.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for that. I thought it was incredibly refreshing, actually, to hear you kind of speak about especially the key challenges that you experienced throughout this kind of journey. I know it's going to be something that's going to be very interesting for a lot of people on the webinar if they're either evaluating Looker or if they're already customers of Looker. So that idea of that change being constant again is really fantastic. For the people on the webinar as well, what I strongly suggest doing is jumping onto AutoTrader's engineering blog, where you can kind of drill into an awful lot of these concepts in much deeper detail. Something that was fantastically interesting even for myself, just to kind of become accustomed to the way that they've reimagined their platform, not just Looker, but how they've reimagined their entire platform. So thank you, Ed. So we've been receiving through kind of a few questions, and we'll jump onto that now. We'll probably dedicate about 10 minutes to it. There's a few questions that kind of cover the same area, so I'll try and group them together in order to kind of keep things efficient. So I'll just kick things off. The question coming in here, Ed. So how do you handle the different cloud providers, AWS and GCP? Is it not expensive to move data around between them?
Yeah, so this pattern of storing data in the data lake in S3, but in the warehouse in BigQuery is perhaps not the most kind of intuitive if you were to look at this, if you were going to design this from the ground up. The reason that we ended up in this situation, by the way, is sort of just historically, it's the way that we built our platform. We started off with the data lake, and it's only after we sort of embedded that in the business that the need for a more structured data warehouse came about. So it's actually not so expensive. The data flowing from the lake to BigQuery is generally already refined. So the raw data is being stored in the lake. It's only the refined data sets that are being pushed across. And obviously with S3 and GCP, you have egress costs. But actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's not that expensive at all. And the process for moving data, by the way, is we're using Airflow. And Airflow has an operator to move data from S3 to GCS, and it has an operator to move data from GCS into BigQuery. So we're just calling those operators, and the data flows through.
Brilliant, Ed. That's great. Yeah, a few questions came around that and the idea of why are you using S3 in conjunction with BigQuery rather than just Google Cloud Storage. So I think that answers that. Second question that comes through, Ed, how many people have gone through the Data Academy courses you spoke about, and how did you ensure that people knew about the training courses? How did you promote them?
Yeah, so our most successful training course was the Looker for business users. So how to explore data in Looker. We've had around about 75 people go through that now, I think. So in terms of promoting it, we've run these courses in a number of different ways. We've run generic ones that are sort of suitable for everyone. And then we've had requests from various different squads. So for example, our delivery leads, one of them has sort of encountered Looker, wanted to know more, and in doing so thought, this would be really useful for the other delivery leads to know about as well. So we've run bespoke courses for them. And the way we do this is we sort of cover the broad concepts around exploring data. That's the same for every audience. And then we'll tailor the second part of the course, which is sort of a deep dive into certain data sets and how to answer specific kind of domain-related questions for those data sets. And we make that relevant for the audience. So for our delivery leads, we really focused in on a data set that they would find most useful. In terms of promoting it, it's broadly been organic. We've got an internal showcase, so once a week the data squads get together and we kind of show the cool stuff that we've been working on, and that's open to everyone in the business. So we've been promoting our courses at that. We've also been using Slack, so we've got a data platform channel in Slack. On that we've been promoting courses that we thought people might be finding useful. But actually the largest kind of source of referrals for these courses has been just organic. People have been on it, they've told their colleagues, and their colleagues have thought, that sounds useful, I'd like to go on that too.
Okay, interesting. So word of mouth probably was the strongest kind of marketing tool, I guess, for Looker internally. That's great.
Yeah.
You spoke a lot around challenges, Ed, and you were very honest and open about them. What challenges are you still facing with the data platform?
So I talked about this way of domain thinking. So this is sort of something that we're trying to apply to our sort of new derived data sets. We've probably not firmly kind of established exactly what constitutes a domain, where the line is, where to kind of try and extend existing data sets, when to build new data sets. That's something that's still very much a sort of a work in progress. So that's probably our biggest challenge, and as well as that, kind of moving away from these kind of monolithic entity-based data sets that we built initially to these more domain-specific data sets. The other big problem for us is cost. So BigQuery is fantastic in that it will just scale to meet the demand. But when the demand is high, that means the amount of data that you're scanning is also high. And that came as a bit of a surprise to us, just how expensive that was going to be. So the important takeaway there is modeling your data in a suitable way and just accepting that perhaps you'll have multiple data sets that serve slightly different use cases, but with a lot of overlap.
Okay, interesting, Ed. Question around the POC, the POC slide that you showed. How long was the POC? And there's a few questions around this, so I might just kind of get them all out. Maybe you can talk a bit more about it. How long was the POC? What was the learning curve like? Example, how many days were needed to understand LookML, how to decide which model, etc. And then were you able to go in and review adoption usage stats of Looker itself in order to enable better enablement?
Indeed, yeah. So the POC was a while ago now. I can't remember exactly how long, but it was several weeks, perhaps over a month, and we had good engagement from Looker. So we kind of set up regular update meetings to kind of. Well, initially it was really important that we kind of set a clear goal. We set, this is what we want to achieve out of Looker. This is how we know it's been successful. And then regular update meetings to kind of make sure that we were moving towards that target. And in doing so, yeah, we had a lot of support from Looker's professional services team. So we actually had someone come and spend a couple of days in the office helping us write some initial LookML and then running training courses with our analysts to get them up to speed as well.
Brilliant. That's great. There's also a few questions coming through, guys, about the recording being available after the webinar. So yes, we will be sharing that to everyone that registered, and you'll be able to see the slides, etc. from that. A few other questions coming through as well. How do you determine what's key to report on in your dashboard reports, viewable to the wider business? Is it based on department by department goals or wider company objectives and KPIs?
Yeah, so it's sort of organic in the sense that any one of our analysts can build a dashboard, and they tend to build dashboards for specific purposes. So they'll be working as part of a wider team. That wider team will kind of have specific questions that they want to answer, and it could be kind of something new that's being built and they want to answer a question specifically for that new product, or it could be something that's kind of known to be a KPI within that team. So it's something that they're measuring as part of their kind of continual assessment of how they're performing. So this, to answer the question, there's been no kind of top-down, these are the KPIs that we will report. It's very much come from the ground up. But the analysts who are building dashboards are building them for specific purposes. So they'll be working with, for example, a product lead, and the product lead will say, well, these are the things that I think are important for my specific area. So let's build a dashboard that have them in.
Very interesting. Okay, and actually there's a little follow-on question from that as well that ties in quite nicely with it from one of the viewers. And it is around can you explain how you managed business growth alongside the transition from legacy to your new data world? And I guess follow-on question: what were you insulated from that? Did you know about this, or were you kind of made aware of this kind of whole transition to the new world?
So do you mind rephrasing the question? This is specifically around transition from print to digital, or
Yeah, I guess so, and that ongoing transition, and even the kind of the transition that's been kind of ongoing over the past few years as you've kind of grown more and more comfortable with digital.
So
how have you managed business growth alongside that?
Yeah, so I mean the key thing is build a platform that's scalable. So because we're in the cloud, we were able to, as the demand for data increases and the amount of data that we're storing increases, then scaling up our platform to kind of store all this new data and fulfill all these new requirements is actually quite easy, just because of the way the cloud works. And in terms of kind of managing growth, actually, we've been trying to promote growth within kind of use of data. And I think there's often a traditional mindset in IT that, if you build this great new product, people will definitely come and use it. And actually, it's really important to kind of take the time before you start building something to understand exactly what the needs are, what people want to be able to do, what they think they're capable of doing, and just make sure that you're building something that does fulfill those needs, rather than just building something for the sake of it.
Exactly. Yeah, that makes sense. I think we have time for one more question before I hand it over to Isabel. And just a note, if we didn't get to your question on this webinar, we'll try and pick them up afterwards and reach out to you with the answers. So if you were to do it again, Ed, would you start with AWS or GCP?
That's a good question. The answer is it depends. So for us, certainly having to kind of cross that cloud barrier does come with some challenges. It's not as straightforward as if we were entirely in AWS or entirely in GCP. But the truth is both platforms offer advantages, and some things are better in some than others. And then for us specifically, we've been using, I talked about Databricks. Databricks haven't yet launched in GCP. So for that reason alone, we'd probably stay in AWS for at least our low-level storage. As a wider business, we're using GCP for Kubernetes deployments, so for kind of hosting our web apps. So we've grown quite comfortable with both cloud providers. In the long term, maybe we'll converge on one, but at the moment, both have things that they do better than the other. So we're able to make the most of that.
The only constant has changed. Yep, I think that's probably a good note to end on. So yeah, thank you so much. You're getting a lot of praise on the Q&As as they're coming through. It seems like it went down pretty well for everybody, and hopefully there'll be a little bit of follow-up again from it once people have had time to digest and once they get a chance to view the recorded presentation. So
That's
thank
great.
you so
thank
much
you very
for
much
your
for
time.
having me. Yeah, no, my pleasure.
Absolutely our pleasure. So I'm going to hand it over to Isabel now just to wrap things up, and thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Really, really interesting presentation and really nice and high level of engagement as well from the audience. So thank you very much. Unfortunately, this is all the time that we have for today. We could have gone on and on, but again, as Tom said, if you have submitted a question that we didn't have the chance to get, someone from Looker and AutoTrader will be in touch with you shortly, and we'll cover those questions and answers in that communication. So I'd like to say thank you to Ed and Tom for their time and for producing this webinar. I'm sure everyone will have found it as useful and informative as I did. With that, I'm going to bring this program to an end. On behalf of Looker, the ETAI team, and WBR Insights, I'd like to thank you all for joining us today, and until next time, take care.